how we let each other so bad. We've got so much. Welcome, everybody. If you were unable to attend this presentation, the slide for which is up now behind, including the date, November the 7th, 2023, we are back, y'all, we back at the History Center, Lake Forest, Lake Bluff. We've returned. Why have we returned? To share with you a presentation that was recorded when we did it, but in fact we got two turns. We want to thank everybody who was in the audience that night for just galvanizing us, giving us all that good energy, and enabling us to have a communal moment of learning. As I say in my culture, we were able to touch and agree, and we just had such a wonderful time. Special thanks is going out to the Lake Forest, Lake Bluff History Center. We are just so honored and so grateful to just continue to be in relationship with y'all moving forward. And so, without further ado, oh wait, I do have to have a little more ado. This is my wonderful colleague, Courtney Pierre Joseph, Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Lake Forest College, and my name is R.L. Watson. I am Assistant Professor of English and African American Studies, also at Lake Forest. And so we present to you a talk that essentially came about as a result of some of the things that were going on in the world in combination with some of the things that have been going on in the past. And you know, just to take a page out of Kathy Park Hong's book, we need to be accountable to history, is something that that is alive and well in my culture, and alive and well in my colleagues' culture. And so it is in the spirit of an accountability to history that we come to you today. What I must do, why must I do this? Because we are talking not only about the living, but we are also talking about the dying and the dead. What I must do is summon the ancestors for not only their presence, but for support in speaking things that in the current climate, and possibly in any climate, are just difficult to speak about. And so I want to call them now to provide that help, to provide that strength, and to provide that clarity. Can't understand why we treat each other in this way, taking up time with the silly little games we play. We've got our love, so no matter what is said and done, we are one. No matter what we do, we are one. And love will see us through, we are one. And that's the way it is, we are one. We are one. We are one. Why am I talking about this oneness? Because there is not a separation between people who are experiencing oppression. There is not a separation between people who are suffering as a result of hierarchies that are in fact extraneous to human thriving at best, if not inhibitive of human thriving. And so I would like to submit to you that there is only one struggle. It is for this reason that a talk like this one that we prepared about the document, We Charge Genocide, that came out in 1951, or at least was delivered to the United Nations in 1951. We said, oh yeah, we're at the History Center, we're going to do some We're going to do some thinking about history. We're going to do some thinking about the archive. And significantly, particularly in the context of the afterlives of slavery, slavery's archive, the archive of Jim Crow, the archives of the new Jim Crow, these are embattled and bruised. They are not whole, and for many reasons, but the largest reason, I think, is our inattentiveness to them. And so it is our deep interest and our deep investment as scholars to say, well, we can invest our time in looking into the archive. We can invest our resources in lifting up the archive. And so again, we thank the History Center for welcoming us for this talk. One of the things that we know about the archive's compromised position is that it requires of us in the present to consider how can we do some reconstruction? How can we do some, and that was the double entendre. That was it, you saw me? I saw that. You found me? I saw that. Okay, so we need to reconstruct a lot of this archive. We cannot allow it to become lost, because when we have no history, we have no people. We must remember ourselves, and I'm talking not only about African Americans, Black Americans, of whom I am one, but I'm talking about the Black diaspora. I'm talking about all of those who are in a struggle for their lives. And so it was in fact in the context of the occupation in Palestine and Gaza that we first gave this talk. And it was a thing that was very, how can I say, energizing on campus. It was very energizing on campus. It was something that so many conversations started to pop up around this. And so not just for those in the academy, not just for those who were students, not just for those on campuses, but worldwide. And so we know now, as an update, that even now in The Hague, South Africa is bringing a case about what is going on in that part of the world today. But in light of the fact that we have, in my prior assertion, but one struggle, seeing solidarity with Armenian students, for instance, after our talk, solidarity with students who are Muslim, students who are Jewish, students who are Hindu, students who practice all different kinds of religion, students who identify as LGBTQAI. I myself do, my pronouns are they, them. I call myself eligible. If you are in fact eligible, please consider it. Please to consider it. But how do we reconstruct an archive? How do we reconstruct a historical archive? One of the ways in which we can do this is through what Charles Mills calls alternative epistemologies. Now, an epistemology just means this is how you know something. It is a way of knowing in shorthand. So to have an epistemic shift requires us to introduce some other means of knowledge. And so you will see some of those represented here today, which include oral history, which include music, as the music I sang earlier. We do need to bring in things into our scholarship, into our research, into our consideration as sources of knowledge, as part of the record, even more broadly than just, okay, well, we have this history book, or we have this encyclopedia, and so that is set. We need to acknowledge the ways in which some of these, the blinders of even academic writing, even popular writing about history, serves to obscure some of these other tales. Including Black tales, y'all. So not only the oral histories, not only the music, but also ancestral knowledge. And this is where I think, my being in English and your being in history has really, created that gumbo to find that ancestral knowledge. Black people did, in fact, write things. Oh my goodness. Black people did, in fact, leave texts behind. Oh my goodness. They were in English, y'all. And so one of those texts left behind, and you know, in African American literature, we find this a lot. There is an intimate connection between literature and history, the telling of one's story, right? So we see African American literature starting even in the autobiographical mode. And so we see also, and shout out to Ida B. Wells, documentation over time of that struggle. So there may be only one struggle, but of course, infinite possibilities for how the negative effects of oppression can show themselves. And so we have specific documentation that we will be looking at today as well. Finally, this event is sponsored by the African American Studies Department now at Lake Forest College. You know, virtual high five. And virtual high five to y'all. Hey! We just want to thank all of our supporters in terms of, you know, folks coming to our events, folks supporting us individually, folks mentoring us. There has just been such an outpouring of support, and we're very, very grateful. And so we bring this program to y'all as an act of love. We gotta love, no matter what we say or do. So I'm just going to teach briefly the chant that we have instituted. And I'm saying we, I mean I did that, but you know. You did. It was tolerated, you know, I was tolerated. You know, sometimes toleration is all you need. Usually not, but in this case it was enough. And so I say A, and y'all say fam. You could do it at your house, you know, or whisper it, you know, if you got your little, you know, I don't know, it's a baby sleeping, but you can mouth it along. And of course, AFAM is just the shorthand for African American Studies. So when I say A, you say fam, A, fam, A, fam. So when I say A, you say fam, fam, A, fam, fam, A, fam, fam. All right. So we are a family. A family. And so that is the ethos under which we teach. You don't have to be black to be part of the AFAM family. You just gotta like black things and like black folk, you know, and in a respectful and loving way. So, and I am going to give this joke, which is, I asked, what does FAM stand for? The A, and what does the F stand for? And I said, freaking American. All right. We've been called not American. They hate on us. But I am one. So you can see Black Americans do, in fact, exist qua Americans. All right, so I keep saying without further ado, and now I'm feeling like, I feel so formal. I'm like imagining the people, I'm imagining y'all at home. So what I'm doing is turning it over to my wonderful colleague to begin to talk about this document and the context, right? So it's not just about the reports, but it's about let's put some flesh on that, right? So we go into the archive, we see something, we see a detail, we see a note, and we think, oh, okay, yeah, that happened, da, 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 da. No, let us use all of our alternative ways of knowing to get up under what those words really mean, what those numbers really mean, and put some flesh onto history. So, historian Courtney Pierre Joseph.
It's me. Hi, everybody. All right, so put this down over here. So I will use my best teacher voice here. Thank you so much for a lovely, multi-talented intro by the, impeccable Dr. Watson. So again, today's talk is thinking about what does it mean? Intent to destroy. What does oppression look like? What does violence look like? And how do folks respond to it? And so we're focusing on the beautiful Paul Robeson here, as my students know, one of my many historical bays, and the other folks who worked with him to create this document, again, that they delivered to the UN in the early 1950s on the anti-Blackness, what they would call, a genocide against African Americans in the United States. Haitians. And so how did they get there?
What are their, again, facts? Well,
in the era that, the moment that they are creating this document, they have, I mean, several centuries, but at this point, it has been a good half of a century long, a little bit more, that they are living under what historians and others would call Jim Crow era of the United States. Give you a quick history of how we get to that point. And so, you know, the United States, colony, British colony, turns into the United States in 1776, although, you know, the British come back in 1812. Anyway, you're probably like, what does all this matter? Anyway, so United States is doing its thing, and one of its things as an independent nation, I should say, is that it builds itself off of the backs of African-American people under the institution, both society and economically, of chattel slavery, as well as the genocide of indigenous folks. And so by the time those, you know, many folks in particular will focus on African Americans struggle for their freedom, and that leads to the US Civil War between 1861 and 1865, we have this brief moment after 1865 where the United States promises to actually recognize the millions of African Americans who become officially US citizens, as you talk about, Americans, adding that to their title with the 14th Amendment. And so there's all of this shifting. You see African Americans going to school, you see them finding their families after slavery, you see them marrying, you see them, you know, setting up homes, creating real lives for themselves, voting for the first time, in particular African American men with the 15th Amendment. And that, unfortunately, is met with a lot of ire, because again, you can't just say something is over without getting into the meat of why it happened to begin with. And so the United States, with its, you know, penchant for amnesia, stops the Reconstruction period by 1877, and by 1896 they have again coalesced and decided the new racial makeup is going to be this idea of separate but equal. So that is what then defines Jim Crow, this Jim Crow period that lasts right until about the, just a few years after the Charge Genocide report is actually given to the UN, is when we start to see the breakdown of Jim Crow in the United States, in particular with the 54 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board, and the desegregation of public schools. But why do they have to do that? Again, I keep saying the words segregation, separate but equal. I don't know about the equal part, but definitely separated, right? A hard racial line, which, you know, another historical babe would say, W.E.B. Du Bois, the, you know, biggest problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And when he says that, he means the fact that you can live in the United States and based on your race, based on your class, based on your religion, but in particular, with Jim Crow, your race, live a completely different life than another American of a different race. And so we're seeing the ways that African Americans are often sequestered into environments where they have little opportunity to do much, although they do a lot with those times. And so even when African Americans say, okay, segregation is the name of the game, we'll create our own communities. We'll do what we can with the little that we got and make something for ourselves. But it's not just about segregation, is it? Because that's when we see the rise of things like lynchings and race massacres. White mobs going into predominantly African-American communities, looking for criminals, typically under the lie, the very you know, lucrative and seductive lie of Black criminality, the idea of Black lasciviousness, that Black people are hypersexual and cannot control themselves. And so that is the guise that is used for white mobs to go into Black communities and kill with impunity. You know about the Tulsa race riot, hopefully, but if not, that is one of many examples of not just one or two people being targeted as in a lynching, but an entire community that gets destroyed because they were separate and they really were equal. And that shows us that the equal part is definitely not part of how folks really enacted Jim Crow segregation violence in the United States. What else is violence? A revision of history. Looking at a historian. Yes, I know I don't look like a lot of the historians you've seen before, but I am. And when I think about the ways that history is told, they're often through grand narratives. That, you know, victors tell the stories, the spoils of the war, and we don't ever hear about it from anyone else. And this happens in particular in many ways, but in the United States we see it with the lost cause revisionist history around the Civil War. You may have heard it along the lines of, and I know a lot of people, in particular right now, I just saw another presidential candidate have a hard time answering what the Civil War was about. Would you like to answer?
States' rights to be...
Lots of slavery. And so, you know, that inability to answer that question is largely because of the, you know, promotion of something like the lost cause. That actually the Civil War was about brothers on the north and in the south, you know, getting all messed up because these black people were, you know, dividing them, and actually they just needed to come together. And that the Civil War was about that separation and not, again, the centuries of black bodies who were subjugated to unspeakable oppression in the name of building this nation for free, deciding that that was enough and pushing their government, Abraham Lincoln included, to end slavery. Not Lincoln freed the slaves. African Americans pushed for their own freedom and ended slavery. And we can't have that in the history, right, of the United States that in some ways describes itself as a melting pot, but is also a, you know, white Christian nation in the way that they define themselves. And so the revision and the rewriting of history is a very violent tool that silences people, not just historically, but into the present day, where it can be a point of discussion to say what caused the Civil War, and the first thing that comes out of your mouth is not slavery. We have things to think like that. Other popular ways of violence, media images. Again, I already joked that you're probably looking at these two like scholars. That's not typically if you Google, you know, the word scholar and not Google scholar. You know, Google the word scholar. Typically, you don't see people like us represented, and that is on purpose. Typically, if you're looking for representation for people who look like us, you're thinking about very entrenched racial stereotypes. Black people are lazy. It's interesting that black people became lazy after they decided they didn't want to work for free anymore, but that's a whole other discussion. Black people, again, are violent. Black people are criminals. You have things like the idea of a mammy, an asexual black woman who works as a domestic and wishes for nothing more beyond her life than to make the white family she works for happy. You see this happen in things like the show Beulah, which is very popular in the 1950s. We see some of this happen in, Birth of a Nation, the first film ever showed at the White House in 1950s, and one of the most racist, 1915, one of the most racist films, pieces of propaganda that promotes not only the lost cause, but these racial stereotypes of black bodies. And so you are either, you know, a mammy, an Uncle Tom, you are, you know, a Jezebel, you are these very specific, one-dimensional ways of thinking about blackness. And that's violent because black people are much more than that and don't fall into these, you know, 5 or 6 stereotypes. As per usual, my students always know I say this, there's going to be a lot of resistance, obviously not simply during Jim Crow, but, you know, after, I mean, through today, of this sort of violence that's happening in multiple fronts. Before I get to that, I did want to point to this map because I hadn't looked at it yet. A lot of students, when they come to my classroom, my history classroom in Lake Forest, and we start to talk about some of this stuff, they talk about sundown towns. Another means of segregation, right? That there are certain towns in the north, not just the south, in the north, that there are, you know, an understanding that if you are African American and you are in this town, you should leave before the sun goes down because something and anything can happen to you. And you should know that for your own protection. And so again, incredibly violent, incredibly threatening. This happens in ways that keeps Black people, again, in very specific spaces. Doesn't think about their freedom of movement, right? Because that means that their safety is not, it's not taken for granted. Like that can happen anytime to them. And so students come to Lake Forest and then they say, so this is sundown town, right? And I'm like, no, actually, Lake Forest is not a sundown town, which always gives them a lot of shock, but actually it's not. Lake Forest has a very interesting racial history, which I'm excited, to continue to investigate. My own research, the grant that we just got that allows us for that, again, thanks to the History Center for being the best partners. But Lake Forest is that blue dot on this map. And all the dots around it are sundown towns. And so even though Lake Forest itself may not be a sundown town, it's surrounded by them, right? And so that means that it can still benefit from the fact that African Americans all around it, they can't stay nearby. So why would Lake Forest, necessarily also be a place that they feel like they can stay if, I think Wheeling, there's a lot of areas. I mean, Illinois has the most sundown towns out of any state in the country. Yes, remember the land of Lincoln, the guy who's freed the slaves, right? You see how these rewriting of histories are seductive and don't allow us to think about the ways that race and racism and these things continue to shape our lives. So if you're thinking about, no, not a sundown town, but definitely friends with an area with a lot of sundown towns. Responses and resistance, we see African Americans organizing, we see them moving. The Great Migration is really what changes the landscape, one of the many things that changes the landscape of the United States in the 20th century, the mass movement of millions of African Americans from the South, the former Confederacy, to northern cities, Midwestern cities, and then eventually to Western cities. So shout out to our colleague from LA, another product of the Great Migration. Because again, if they don't want me to be there, it's fine. I'll leave. But again, we know that that's not it, because really there's no safety anywhere. Your own community can still be targeted from outsiders. Self-defense, which is something that I think a lot of folks have a hard time grasping. For certain folks, some people are allowed to defend themselves. Other people, not so much. You have a lot of pushback I see of protests, right? Oh, you should be a peaceful protester, or you should protest in this way. Defend yourself in these very, muted fashions. Even if you are facing intense oppression and violence, it's all about your ability to not make it worse. Again, I think that's violent as well, and more violent than people standing on their human right to defend themselves. That is a human right. I mean, I have a beagle. She knows how to defend herself. She's 20 pounds. And so to imagine that I would try to take that from her is so far beyond my realm of thinking, in the same way to me that it would seem so preposterous to imagine you would try to take away or define folks' right to self-defense. And so African Americans have always been defending themselves in multiple ways, including cultural resistance. I mean, you just heard my friend and colleague say, I'm not going to do that to you because I don't sound like that, but song, dance, art, books, poems, productions, fashion, hip hop. These are examples of cultural resistance that African Americans have engaged in, and some of these things that become markers of our own cultural resistance end up becoming defining of American culture. The Harlem Renaissance, one of the few things I think they teach about in school, although I don't know anymore. That's born out of the cultural resistance of the Jim Crow movement. People were moving to Harlem, again, migration, And they were engaging and trying to figure out how to respond to this intense oppression that is hitting them daily, both individually and as communities. And so hip hop is a very similar thing that happens in the late 20th century. And so this talk is also about the ways, again, that we think about anti-Blackness in the modern era nationally. I mean, we're tying it globally, right? As, again, my colleague said, we are one. But I wanted to also think about how that looks very locally, since, you know, we've been doing research on African-American presence and experience in Lake Forest, and at, in particular, the college where we will teach at. And I think that we can see the ways that segregation and Jim Crow violence even shaped the experiences of people living here. For example, there were absolutely no Black students that attended Lake Forest College. I'm sorry, a few attended, but no Black students graduated between 1908 and 1945. That is because the first Black graduate graduated in 1907, so about 50 years after the institution had opened, and then it takes another about 50 years for another Black student to graduate. What does that mean for how we think about Black folks thriving in this space today? What does that mean to think about the fact that there are students who were able, and professors and other people who were able to engage with the college for decades without ever having to experience or encounter Black people? That is violence to make that possible. You have to be thinking in a negative way to keep people out in that way. And so when I think about the ways that, again, violence looks and functions over the course of this period and why it eventually leads to something like the We Charge Genocide report being written, it's because we see the effects in all sorts of ways of segregation and how that's shaping various spaces. Stereotyping, as I said, is violent, right? And so I just talked to you on the previous slide about how for, you know, about 3.5 decades, no Black students attended the college. And maybe some might ask at home, well, maybe, you know, there's just like not any Black people around, or the people who were thinking about it, which, I mean, that's not true, but, you know, not around, or, you know, maybe the college just didn't want to engage with ideas of Black people and Black identity. Well, we can't say that because we have archival evidence, and shout out to my students, I believe. There's too many to list at this point, but so many of my students who have helped with this research. I cannot have done this without them and their tenacity in going through these archival documents, and they find things like this. And it's always so cute when they find things like this, because I have students at present day coming to me and saying, Dr. Joseph, as looking in the research you asked me to look for, and I found this. It's like really bad. I don't know. It feels bad, and I'm like, oh, it is bad. But then I high five it. I'm excited as a historian because this again shows us the ways that violence is diverse and is happening on multiple fronts. So no Black students, but we are having minstrel shows, right? The term Jim Crow actually comes from a minstrel performance of Blackness, a stereotypical one-dimensional idea of a Black person in tattered clothes who is just happy to sing and dance and be frolicking free. That's what a minstrel performance is. And so right on campus, you know, you might want to take your boo in the early 1900s on a Valentine's Day date to go see the minstrel show. And profiting off of this, there were many minstrel shows on campus between in the first half of the 20th century, all documented in yearbooks, in you know, student press, all of that, that shows that this was normal. And in fact, people in the town and the community would also come to the campus to see these performances. And it speaks again to the ways that, no, it's not that Blackness is absent completely, it's that it is stereotyped Blackness. That's the only acceptable Blackness in this space. And if we were to invite Black people of different varieties to be here, it would, you know, kind of contradict this idea of what, again, Black people are supposed to be doing and seemingly are happy to be doing. Minstrel performances, again, well, there are some Black performers who do engage in minstrel performances. They're typically white performers dressed in burnt cork on their face. You know, again, this kind of idea of Blackness and poverty, and a lack of intelligence too, is what I think of. You know, a very lack of morality and lack of, you know, self-knowledge in a way that would promote this idea of why we need Jim Crow segregation. Violence is also intersectional. I think when the last time we did this is one of the times I think everybody started screaming, you know, in the space. But one of the things as I've been working on, again, what will be my second book project, which is looking at Black presence at Lake Forest historically, I have gotten so much support from alum, and alum from all over the place. And so I received a phone call from an individual, a class of 1963, who saw that I was starting to do this research and called my office phone and said, I would love to talk to you about my experience there as a student, and something that, you know, happened very directly to me that I think would speak to what you're doing research on. And so he tells this story, and I will let you know, you all read it on your own time, but he tells me the story of being in a fraternity and trying to pledge the first Jewish member in their fraternity. And so they figured out a way to do it. They knew that they'd probably maybe get them in trouble nationally, but, you know, with their fraternity, you know, the main, I forget what you call it, like the head of the fraternity. But they did it anyway, because to them, why wouldn't we let a Jewish student into our fraternity? It definitely goes bad, okay? The national fraternity came back and said no. He goes all the way to California from Lake Forest to go plead his case at the national meeting. And while at this national meeting where he has to go and defend the decision to allow somebody just because they're not Christian into the fraternity, he also hears this anti-Black violence from folks in the fraternity. And it's like a slap in the face to him. But in many ways, it makes sense that anti-Semitism is very closely related to anti-Blackness. They're still built on these same sort of oppressive hierarchical systems, right? And so to act as if those two things are not in conversational relation to each other, I think, you know, it tries to make us think about the ways that we are not all one, right? And that is a tool of, you know, folks in power is to divide and conquer, right? And so if you can't see your struggle in a struggle that somebody else is, even if they don't look directly like you, now you're fighting. As opposed to being able to see, wow, the same people who won't allow a Jewish student in the fraternity also would never allow a Black person in said fraternity as well. And so this, you know, as he said, I'm giving you a mentality from the nationalist point of view and the student point of view and the administration point of view. Realizing that these things were interrelated and intersectional, I think shows again why we have to think about violence more broadly.
And then, you know,
celebrating death of, you know, groups of people, again, who you have fallen under kind of the media propaganda messaging that certain people's lives matter more than others.
Certain people are monsters.
Certain people are monsters. Certain people do not deserve to live. Or, you know, when encroached on, we erase the ways that they are encroached on, and then we just talk about them as being randomly violent. Oh man, don't go over there because those people just randomly violent. But we are never given the context of, well, why is violence happening there? And in particular, what kind of violence is happening there? Because violence happens in every community. Some communities just feel like there's certain violence that's better than others, just like, you know, certain death is okay to celebrate, and otherwise we have to have, you know, a national day of mourning depending on who has died. And so this lovely little piece comes to us from the Center, the newspaper of the college, the main newspaper of the college, in the wake of Dr. King's assassination in 1968. Next week is Dr. King Day, so just an early happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
Happy King Day.
You know, the first African-American holiday ever dedicated in this country, which happens during both of our lifetimes. They don't get a MLK Day until 1986 or 87, I think is when it is signed into law.
Yeah,
But, yeah, it was
and I listened to that album. Shout out to Stevie Wonder and shout out to Coretta Scott King.
every day, happy birthday song.
Okay.
So as we're thinking about, I mean, even just now seeing us reflect on Dr. King Day and like, you know, thinking about how it's been informative in our lives and there's, you know, something to celebrate. We also remember that we have to do that with reverence because this is a man who was martyred at the age of 39 for speaking out against this intersectional violence, this Jim Crow violence, all the stuff that we've been talking about thus far today. And at this campus, when Dr. King was murdered April 4th, 1968, they decide to have, I mean, there are national outcries, protests, international folks are very much upset about this. And so the college decides to give a day of mourning on the Monday afterwards. And so you see a letter from a Black student that he writes to the editor of the center where he talks about, you know, how much this day was supposed to mean to him, and he was really excited, and you know, finally, this happens, 1968, this is now the largest Black class that has ever happened at the college. And so you have, for the first time, a large mass of Black students. One of their heroes, for many of them, has passed away. And they think there's going to be this time of reverence and remembrance from their college campus. And unfortunately, there were students who spent that night, as he described it on South Campus, a collage of drunken cheers for fireworks and buffoonery. Time that should have been spent in a reevaluation on the part of all peoples was better utilized by the whites on this campus for participation in the barbaric rites and ceremonies they call fun. And so to imagine that, and South Campus is actually the site of where there used to be an African-American church in Lake Forest, and research is showing more and more African-American homes were on South Campus. So we think about location even in space. The fact that that is the space that they decided to then celebrate the murder of a Black leader who again was fighting for equality says something about the ways that violence continues, right? And that even though they may not have been the ones who pulled the trigger on Dr. King, to engage in this in the face of the largest class of Black students is violent. And so these are the sorts of local experiences that help us to see the ways that Jim Crow segregation in that system was shaping, again, on the national level, was shaping the very much local level, even in a place like Lake Forest, Illinois. And so these are the sorts of instances, experiences that eventually lead to the report that my friend and colleague will now relay to you, the intent to destroy, we charge genocide.
Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Fran.
Amen. You know, hydration is very important. Get into it, y'all. Drink water. I pray clean water for you and all around the earth.
So first things first, what are you looking at? Who you are looking at is one Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson. If you have not had the opportunity to hear Paul Robeson's voice, to see his performances, to just bask, okay, in the thirst, please.
Avail yourself. I'm sure there are many things you can get into on the interwebs these days. But this is actually Paul Robeson handing this petition, We Charge Genocide, to the United Nations representative here, And you see that we have in this document a record of a communal accounting, a communal collecting. William L. Patterson edited this volume, and we have not only a description of the case against the United States insofar as Black Americans are concerned and the treatment of Black folks are concerned, but also records of incidences that happened in a short period right before this report was put together. All right, so let's get into it. The document is We Charge Genocide. Now, first things first, we do have to appreciate our own thirst. This is indeed Paul Robeson. Yes, you were correct. It is indeed Paul Robeson. And if you weren't correct, get into him, look him up, hear his wonderful voice, see his wonderful performances, representation. We're getting all this Black representation, but on the one hand, you think, oh, well, this is an entertainer, this is a performer. Like many Black entertainers and performers of the 20th century, Paul Robeson was also an activist, which is part of the reason why, and Frank, you brought up the Harlem Renaissance, it's part of the reason why it's very, very difficult to study African American culture in a vacuum. Because in a lot of cases, it is interweaved, if you will, it intersects with the work of activism that is going on behind the scenes. And so Paul Robeson, who ultimately did get into trouble for, run around the globe, on some activist activities, was the one to, in 1951, deliver this petition. It is a massive petition, over 200 pages, was delivered to the United Nations in Paris in 51. And one of the things that we notice about this document is that it not only makes the case in terms of definitions, right? So what is genocide? How does this fit in with that category of genocide? And what are the ways in which it can be seen in the society, and in this case, in the experience of African Americans? And so I would encourage you all, in light of what I spoke about earlier, in this idea of unity of struggle, that there is only one, that we do comparative readings to look at what is in the historical record for folks who have undergone similar experiences. In this case, Black folks who, by the way, if you don't know, now is your day to know, congratulations. Black people are not immigrants. Africans coming before the civil rights movement were not immigrants. One of the things that I think serves to erase slavery the most is as part of that rhetoric around, well, why did we fight this war? But also coming in, it's a big melting pot and, people come here for freedom. And it's like, well, my people didn't come here for freedom. Apparently we came here for the experience of genocidal policies, practices, and treatment. And so this We Charge Genocide petition argues and seeks to demonstrate that the government of the United States was in violation of the UN Genocide Convention. The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide had been adopted in 1948 in the aftermath of the Holocaust. We've been talking a lot about one of the most iconic and devastating acts of genocide in human history, which we have in the 20th century in the form of the Holocaust. We've been speaking a lot about that. And in that same spirit of comparative reading, my people are also looking at what has been legislated and dictated about where we can find a definition for genocide so that we can prevent and punish those who are engaging in genocidal activity. It was always about human being as a category that supersedes all other categories. Now, me, myself, I could talk about animal studies all day. I could talk about, the idea of a collectivity of being, but we're in 1951. So we're thinking in terms of humanity. And so we can also see a similar type of bent in what is known as international humanitarian law. And this is, again, I mentioned, we have some activity going on at The Hague recently. If you want to know more about the contours of this argument about genocide and what is and is not, you can look into the ways in which adjudications are being made about, is this actually criminality within the context even of war? There has to be a limit. Even if we are fighting, even if we are beefing, there are rules of engagement, and those rules of engagement must be followed. And the international community is watching, is the concept. So just as a little footnote, if you are curious, this a summary description of We Charge Genocide is taken from Washington State's Mapping American Social Movements project. I said, let me get a distillation real quick, and then we're going to go into a little bit of the nitty-gritty. So this is Susan Glenn, who writes, We Charge Genocide documented 152 recent killings and 344 other crimes of violence against African Americans, as well as other human rights abuses committed in the United States against its own citizens from 1945 to 1951. Very interesting that we have just this nice little slice. We're not talking about 1619 to 1951, although we could, but we already got 200 pages, so let's cut it off. Ain't nobody got time for that. So this represented only a small sample. Even within that window of time, it represented only a small sample because most crimes against Black people went unrecorded, unreported, and unanswered. I'm going to say that again. Most crimes went unreported. This again is part of the bruising of the archive. What good does it do you to report this? Might you not endanger more Black people in your community, your family, your children, your parent, your sibling, as a result of squawking, right? When you are brutalized. Is it going to be something that will benefit and arrive in a place of justice and accountability? Or is it going to invite even more violence? Because how dare you try to use the courts? How dare you try to stand up for yourself? How dare you speak up? And it goes back to what my colleague was saying about self-defense. Whom is allowed to defend themselves? And that's on Malcolm. So, the evidence presented in this petition had been culled from the Black press, which included the Pittsburgh Courier, the Black Dispatch, the Amsterdam News, and from reports by the Tuskegee Institute. We have been, as Black folks, telling our own stories for a long time. And the preservation of a lot of this history is happening through grassroots activism, through Black entrepreneurship, and Black independent research and resources being put toward, let's keep the record. And the record is so important, particularly when one is in the position of the weak versus the strong. We do need to keep the record. How do you sustain a struggle? How do you sustain a fight for one's rights, a fight for one's liberty, a fight for, as I said before, clean water, clean air, a place to stay, safety, education, healthcare? How do we sustain that fight? Well, in the first place, we do need a record of where we've been, a record of what we've tried, a record of how it's gone. And so this record is then distilled and put into We Charge Genocide in 1951, which was again presented in 1970. And honestly, it could have been presented yesterday, quite frankly. As we've seen through the explosion of attention on Black Lives Matter movement, on the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as on the specific names of the dead. It's giving kind of a similar feel. Say her name, right? We want to record this for the archive, for the record, so that a knowledge of history can guide us in preventing further human rights violations. You know, that would be nice. That sounds good to me. I like it. I like it. So 94 individuals signed this petition, and William Patterson actually flew to Paris as well in 1951 to deliver it to the members of the United Nations Committee on Human Rights. The petition received favorable publicity overseas, but was denounced in the United States and disavowed by other civil rights groups. It's giving divide and conquer. Y'all are not the same, and so you can also participate in anti-Blackness, right? Which of course is part of the consideration of this talk. Black people aren't protesting right. They're not correct in their definition. They're not doing the right thing. They're not, even in keeping the record, they don't understand the meaning of, it's like, what are you talking? What are you talking?
This is discrimination. It's not genocide.
It's not genocide. We're just haters. Toughen up.
Get it together.
Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, okay? Suck it up. That idea, oh, no, it's not that, that's too bad, is also a means of creating a hierarchy in terms of who can say, they killing us out here, and it hurts. They're killing us out here. They're killing our futures, and it hurts. You don't need any special kind of knowledge to know that you are down bad. Come on, let's be real. Even an ant know is down bad, getting burned on a sidewalk. Even an ant know this is not the time for me and my people. So we have the United States saying, nah, y'all doing too much. And, you know, even other folks fighting for their freedoms and their human rights said, nah, those niggas, they doing too much. We don't want to be involved with them. And so when Patterson returned to the United States, he had his passport revoked by the United States State Department, and he was banned from further travel abroad. So I don't have time to go into this right now, but if you're interested in reading more about this case, we have the label communist, we have the label Marxist, right, which has evolved now today, being leveled against folks who were just saying, hey, y'all are behaving in a genocidal manner towards Black Americans. Not under our own definition, but in fact, under the convention in December 9th of 1948. And we have, I think, how can I thought of a bunch of things at once, actually. I thought about Ida B. Wells in the Red Record saying, I'm not going to make up my own data. I'm not going to, not even make up my data, but I'm not going to write my own definitive analysis because I'm working with what the Tribune said. And the Chicago Tribune already did this. A white-led organization already did this, or at least a white sponsor. We're going back to Woodrow Wilson now. We have a sponsored organization that has already spoken. Let me build on that, because if I build it from the ground up, from within my community, it is subject to being dismissed as, well, that's just Black people complaining too much. Black people don't know enough. Black people's is ignorant. They don't know how to define words. What? And that's on Toni Morrison. And that's on W.E.B. Du Bois. And that's on Frederick Douglass. Come on. W.E.B. Du Bois all day, day. So the question becomes, and these are my questions that I share with you. The question becomes, who is allowed to report genocidal action? Because we see Patterson being punished for just saying the word genocide in affiliation with how African Americans are being treated in the United States. Who is allowed to report it? And then further, whose deaths and systemic oppression is considered worthy of the legal title of genocidal? We see this happening in The Hague today, this very day, an argument about, well, it's not really that, and y'all are being just dramatic.
Yeah,
23,000 people dead, children. And again, to return to the rules of engagement.
Protect those who are not fighting, such as civilians, medical personnel, or aid workers. That's number one. I'm not even talking about all the others. This is number one. Protect those who are no longer able to fight, like someone who is already injured, someone who is already incapacitated. Black people know that experience. To be stomped when you're down.
So, to return, let's take a look at the definition that was sourced by the many contributors to We Charge Genocide. So first we have, well, let me just read it for you. I'll give you the context. I'm gonna read it real quick. Let me just give you a little taste, okay, of the tone, right? So this is taken from Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Genocide's a crime, y'all. I don't know, it's giving, well, I didn't, and to take a page out of your slang, I didn't murder them, I just unalived them. It just unalived you. I didn't murder you. I just took your life away. Semantics. Semantics. Is someone dead or not? Is the question for me. Okay. So whose deaths are worthy of that title? Mass deaths, which ones are worthy? I have just a quick aside as somebody that was, born in the 80s, the things that I was able to see included calling genocidal actions, quote, ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing. So it's insult to injury really now, because now you're saying I'm dirty and I have to die. So you have to be clean from me. Okay, so let me just a little sidebar, some of the things we learned in the 80s, you know what I'm saying, in the 90s, don't often get spoken on, but they should. So the definition, it says, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy. Intent to destroy. You know how folks say, well, that was not my intent?
Oh, yes.
I didn't mean to.
Yes.
That's why we have a whole other category in the statutes that says if you accidentally hurt someone or accidentally kill someone, that's manslaughter versus murder. So this is about intent. It means I wish to cause this harm. So these are any acts, excuse me, any of the following acts committed with an intent to destroy in whole or in part. I have to say that again. Or in part. So just because it is not a total annihilation, a decimation of a people, that to wipe them off the face of the earth, just because it does not fully succeed, doesn't make it not genocide or genocidal, at the very least. So we say in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as, and I will add eligible, right? So we can talk about gender, we can talk about sexuality, we can talk about all other, just think intersectionally about this. So number A, I did it again. I think the ancestors wanted me to play with that, I guess, I don't know. Number A, killing members of the group. Okay, well, that seems straightforward. And it's giving lynching. To be killed because you are Black. Okay, to be killed because you helped a Black person. You're not Black yourself, but you helped somebody Black. You're being killed. Anybody who tries to do anything positive for the group being killed, genocide, right? And we can think about cancel culture and how cancel culture has been deployed against people who speak the things that are in fact the truth, mathematically speaking. Who is silenced? Who is punished? Number B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, which would have to include what is known as internalized self-hate, internalized racism, internalized Islamophobia, internalized anything, internalized queerphobia, internalized hate. You call it mental harm, or you can cause it mental harm because, as Stevie Wonder said, you already know us. You might have the cash, but you cannot cash in your face. We don't want you living in here. Nah, nah, nah. I said you might have the cash, but you cannot cash in your face. Why can't I cash in my face? But I have money. The mental harm, the emotional harm, the spiritual harm that happens. And I know it in my body, in my flesh, in my bones. I carry the generational trauma of rejection just at the sight of me as a baby child. Can you imagine you walk into a room and the whole room is like, ugh, and you're a baby. Harm, that is harmful. Number C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Where are you allowed to live? And is that place that you're allowed to live in shrinking? Shout out to the indigenous. Shout out to indigenous folks all around the world. To what extent is the place that you're able to live, able to build a life, able to go, able to move freely in? Is it a pool that is just draining and draining and draining away its resources so that you can no longer exist, right? So it's, again, physical destruction. And again, I would put emphasis on the in whole or in part. What part? How many lives? Do we need a number? Is there a threshold? How macabre is that to say there is a threshold before which, we will not acknowledge your death? Enough people didn't die. So thousands of Blacks may be lynched and their friends as well. But because it wasn't 10,000 that year, we don't have to think about it or worry about it. These are things that creep up slowly and on every possible front. So when you're seeing killing, best believe there have been a lot of other structures that of a systemic nature that have participated to the conditions that allow that kind of treatment. Number D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. I'm sorry, man, I had to pause. This one hurts me every time when I think about it. Yeah. What happens when you are stripped from your people? What happens when there is barely consensual, if not non-consensual adoptions? What happens when you are, your maternal birth rate and death rate are reflective of the genocidal conscience of the society?
More Black women today, no matter what their education, class level, are at risk of dying in childbirth in this nation at rates higher than things that we would call the quote-unquote third world.
It is unreal to me how we continue to ignore the ways, and again, it's all back to mathematics, because the way that we continue to ignore the ways in which class doesn't matter, achievement doesn't matter, location doesn't matter. You could be Serena Williams, you could be a world superstar and wealthy, and it doesn't matter. Why? Because you're Black. That is where we can start to discern and delineate the lines of intent to destroy.
On the basis of identity. Number E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And I've alluded to it now. We can think about the schools for Native children that, not only did they rip the children from that group, from that connection, but they also then on top of that abused them and murdered them. There are no words. Now you see why I had to call the ancestors today, because there are no words for these things. Besides the one word that it is very difficult for us to be able to say.
Isn't it interesting that folks are more upset and uncomfortable with calling something what it is rather than the action itself?
I mean, it's appearances.
So no, that's not genocide.
No.
And it's much more important to fight about it being called that than it is to fight the mechanisms that are killing people, whether you want to call it genocide or not.
I mean, you know, do we, like, at what point do we follow up with, okay, well, which people do you care about? Because then we arrive back at the definition of racism, the definition of any kind of hierarchical exclusion,
or any of
any kind of like mechanism of exclusion, mechanism of rejection. Well, you must ascribe to one of those because you seem to be okay with the deaths. It's just I don't want to call it that because it's not that. It's not that serious.
It hurts people's feelings.
It hurts people's feelings to discover that nearly a quarter of folk in Gaza are dealing with hunger and absolute deprivation. It's just not okay. It's just not going to be okay.
It's just not. And some things are worth more than appearances. All right, so Article 2, this is just to kind of tie off the nod that We Charge Genocide gives to the UN Convention's definitions, because it's not only are we interested in defining genocide, okay? It wasn't like, here's what it is, but no, we want to punish this behavior, is what they say. So this is giving, you know, obviously after World War II, for obvious reasons, we're looking at the Holocaust and they said, whoa, never again, never again. And they said with such moral authority, because what is that but evil? What is that but evil? Anti-Semitism just as evil as Islamophobia, just as evil as anti-Black racism, just as evil as anti-AAPI, and et cetera, on down the line. Transphobia, queerphobia, violence against people who are different. It's the same tree, it's the fruit of the same tree. So they said we have to punish these things. Well, what can we punish? Genocide, okay. B, conspiracy to commit genocide. Now this is giving us a little slippery. So anybody who is like, you know what, we should kill it. Now, you know, I will say, you know, you'll get a you know, personal, you know, give yourself a little prize, give yourself a cookie if you can find how Benjamin Franklin may or may not have been in this little B area when he spoke about how it might be better to end slavery by killing all the Black folk and just letting it lie. It was too much effort. You know, we had to figure it out another way, but it was a thing, you know, that maybe we could do after slavery was ended, just kill them all. Okay, this is not new. This is not new behavior. C, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, and E, complicity in genocide. So when we are complicit, and I'm not gonna say nothing further about who may or may not be complicit. Why? Because I'm trying to live. Get more talks like this. All right. So I just want to share this, which is taken from We Charge Genocide. I think this was significant, and it has guided my reading, not only of current events, but of past events, historical events, and events really all around the world, because, you know, the world is vast. We don't see on the news all of the genocidal actions that are taking place around the world, but I'll tell you right now that they are. We shout to the Uyghurs, we shout to, as I said earlier, the Armenians. Are you good? Oh, no.
10.
Oh, okay. And so, you know, it is giving us like a type an example of a type of behavior. So it is sometimes incorrectly thought that genocide means the complete and definitive destruction of a race or people. The Genocide Convention, however, adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations, December 9th, 1948, defines genocide as any killings on the basis of race, or in its specific words as, quote, killing members of the group. Any intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, racial, ethnic, or religious group is genocide, according to the convention. Thus, the convention states, quote, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group is genocide, as well as, quote, killing members of the group. This is broad. This is broad stuff. And it implicates us. I'm just going to pause here briefly for a little content advisory. I'm going to take you quickly through the data that actually backed up this petition. But there are some images that, I mean, I was going to say may be uncomfortable, but they are uncomfortable images. All right, first. So as I mentioned, We Charge Genocide documents 152 recent killings, 344 other crimes of violence against Black people in the United States. And we see here the map. They are wide-ranging. Of course, we have a concentration in the South. That makes sense, right? If we think about where populations of people are during this time, and where the larger number of Black people live, you know, we're in Great Migration territory, but we also still have heavy concentrations of Black folk that would be experiencing this kind of violence. Again, most of these crimes, this is what's being reported. So this is a small percentage of what we would be really dealing with in full. As I mentioned, going into the archives, you need to bring some spiritual anointing with you. And this is archived of any kind of genocide. This, of course, we're talking about anti-Black genocidal behavior in the United States. But we know this intent to destroy. We have known it a long time. And this, in fact, is the title page of this document, We Charge Genocide. You'll see that I've put here the lyrics to Strange Fruit, which was recorded by Billie Holiday in 1939. That is what she is talking about. She is talking about bodies on this land. So when we think about, where do we have museums? Where do we have monuments? Where do we have plaques? Where do we recognize these moments? There's so much going on in the shadows of American history that it is time to bring more and more of these stories, these experiences and tales to light. So one of the things that I have been asking myself is, to what extent do these accounts matter? You know, we've been seeing them play like videos of Black death on repeat on the news, round and round and round and round. Thankfully, you know, it seems to have slowed down. Maybe somebody told somebody somewhere at MSNBC, like, you know what, you don't actually have to show the video on repeat. There is a certain pornographic nature to our engagement with the death of the other, in this case, the deaths of Black Americans, the deaths of Palestinians, the deaths of Jews, in fact. And so the ways in which we are looking and the ways in which we receive these images can oftentimes give us a cue about how much or how little we are supposed to care. How much are we allowed to be outraged? And so I've been wondering, like, do these kinds of normative epistemologies, in fact, erase our knowledge? We know when something is messed up, and we know when people are being killed in the community. If your sibling is dead, your friend is dead, you know that. you feel that, you suffer that. If the majority of folks in your community are being locked up, they are being over-policed, et cetera, you know what's going on. So if the wider narrative does not reflect what you know, in what ways do your accounts matter? And what ways are they pigeonholed? Oh, no, that's not what you think it is. That's not genocide. So, as Maria Makaba said, hope is a discipline, not a feeling. So I wanted to talk a little bit about hope, because you cannot live in the space of death every day. You can't do it. You can't do it. Because at that point, it's, well, why do we even go on? If all that we're here for is for this kind of abuse, this kind of killing, this kind of erasure, then why, I mean, no, we need to dig, right? And so I thought to myself, just to self-locate, I was raised in the church. Now I have my own theology. Stay tuned. But one of the things that I think about is the things that I learned about the Abrahamic faiths. So I said, let me look at what is happening here in terms of when we think about genocide. If something is genocidal and there is a refusal to name it, there is a refusal to say, no, that's wrong. That needs to not. We cannot be out here killing babies. We cannot be out here doing these things on large scale like this, or in part. Isaiah 5:20, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. We cannot, I think, sit in a position where we allow someone to tell us what we know cannot be. It's so destructive. Right? And then that becomes that sort of, again, that internalization of the violence. So then I next said, okay, and I consulted our dear colleague and one of my dear Muslim friends, and I said, you know what? Let's go in and see. So this is taken from Surah Ibrahim 14. They devised every plot which was fully known to Allah, but their plotting was not enough to even overpower mountains, let alone Allah. So do not think, O Prophet, that Allah will fail to keep his promise to his messengers. This is about enjoining right and prohibiting wrong. This is not something that is an option. And so again, we're seeing, right, and I'm not telling y'all anything new. I presented this, of course, before when we had an audience of folks of all different faiths, both Abrahamic and non-Abrahamic faiths. But folks came up in the end and said, like, oh no, in my culture also we have a similar type of understanding of truth-telling about wrongdoing. And so I'll close this little section on hope with quench not the spirit. This is Thessalonians from the Christian context. Despise not prophesying, prove all things, hold fast that which is good, and abstain from all appearance of evil. Abstain from the appearance of evil, but don't try to change the appearance so that it look like you're abstaining. You see what I'm saying? Like it's giving. Talking up the side of your neck. We don't do that. We don't like it. We don't condone it. All right, this is my penultimate slide. I just wanted to shout out quickly Ta-Nehisi Coates, 2015. Many of you will know about this text. It's called Between the World and Me. It is in fact a descendant of James Baldwin's text, The Fire Next Time. And he writes in an epistolary mode, AKA a letter mode. And he says, and there it is, the right to break the Black body as the meaning of their sacred equality. And that right has always given them meaning, has always meant that there was someone down in the valley, because a mountain is not a mountain if there is nothing below. You and I, my son, are that below. making meaning through this kind of genocidal treatment and an agreement upon it. So I will close here with, there is only one struggle, and this idea of rhizomes over roots. The idea being that, and oh my gosh, I'm like, where is, let me see if I can get you a citation. Because there is a wonderful text on this and I don't want to take it amiss. But this idea is essentially that when we think about ourselves as trees, that we are discrete. But you see, even trees are not discrete. They communicate with one another. In fact, their roots intertwine. But there is another type of way that plants dig themselves down and they get that nourishment, and it is through rhizomes, which means the plant is growing, 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 and anywhere you cut it, it will not only survive, but it can make a whole other plant and be removed out and still yet apart and keeping the identity, right? But able to spread. The unity that there can be in thinking about our struggles as not only interrelated, but essentially a part of the same matter, I think can provide us a little bit of methodology for a way forward. And so it has been my hope, and I think I would say that we've been seeing that even in our work on campus, that, yeah, we can, our Latinos Unidos, or our, Umoja, our International Black folks, South Asian Students Organization. We've had, the Rainbow Pride networks on campus. We've seen the ways in which we can all actually come together and see this. The ways in which, when we tell our stories in a circle, they are interrelated, they are reflective of one another. And so it is my hope that we continue these kinds of conversations and being able to tell our stories in safety. And so I think we have been kind of stepping out a little bit here from safety. I feel like safety kind of, I'm like, whoa. Okay, well, oh, whoa. But I leave you again with the hope that we can call a spade a spade. And that through calling a spade, we can understand the ways in which we are, in fact, one. Sometimes I feel that we try to make each other sad. The things we do, how we make each other feel so bad. But we got our love, and no matter what is said or done, we are one. No matter what we do, we are one. Our love will see us through, we are one. And that's the way it is, we are one. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Hydrate.
Communicate.
Communicate. Activate.